A successful businessman tried to destroy the woman who loved him most, only to discover she had cards up her sleeve he never imagined. A woman whose physical limitations became the weapon her husband used against her, until one day she turned the tables in the most spectacular way imaginable. Margaret Chen had always been extraordinary. At 34, she possessed one of the sharpest legal minds in San Francisco, her wheelchair never slowing down her pursuit of justice for her clients. She had been born with spina bifida, but her parents, Dr. Henry Chen and Professor Linda Wang Chen, had raised her to see her condition not as a limitation, but as a different path to greatness. Her home office was filled with law books, legal awards, and photographs of the countless cases she had won, helping families fight against corporate giants. Her husband, Richard Sterling, was everything Margaret thought she wanted when they met 7 years ago at a legal conference: tall, charismatic, and wealthy from his family's real estate empire. Richard seemed to see beyond her wheelchair to the brilliant woman within. At 38, he commanded respect in every room he entered, his silver-streaked hair and designer suits making him the epitome of success. Sterling Properties owned half of downtown San Francisco, and Richard had inherited both the business acumen and the ruthless ambition of his father. "You know what I love about you, Margaret?" Richard had said during their wedding day, his hand gently touching her face as she sat in her elegantly decorated wheelchair, wearing a custom-made ivory gown. "You fight harder than anyone I know. You never give up." Margaret's best friend and law partner, Sarah Martinez, had been skeptical from the beginning. A fierce Latina attorney with curly black hair and eyes that missed nothing, Sarah had built their law firm from the ground up alongside Margaret. She lived in the apartment above their office, dedicating her life to their shared mission of helping the underrepresented. "I don't trust him, Mags," Sarah had whispered during the wedding reception, watching Richard charm the guests with his easy smile and perfect manners. "Something about the way he looks at your chair when he thinks no one's watching." Margaret's younger brother, David Chen, a successful surgeon at UCSF, had similar concerns. At 29, David possessed the same razor-sharp intelligence as his sister, but where Margaret was diplomatic, David was blunt. His protective instincts toward his sister had only intensified after their parents died in a car accident 3 years prior. The Sterling family mansion in Pacific Heights became Margaret's prison, though she didn't realize it at first. The house was beautiful: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. But it was also Richard's domain. His mother, Eleanor Sterling, a 70-year-old socialite with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a smile that never reached her eyes, had made it clear from day one that Margaret would never truly belong. "Richard dear," Eleanor would say during family dinners, her voice dripping with false sweetness, perhaps Margaret would be more comfortable eating in the library. These formal dining chairs can be so challenging. Margaret's personal assistant and secret confidant, Maria Santos, a 52-year-old former nurse who had worked for the Chen family for over a decade, noticed the subtle changes immediately. Maria had graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that never stopped moving, always anticipating Margaret's needs before she voiced them. The first crack in their marriage appeared during a charity gala 18 months after their wedding. Margaret had been invited to speak about disability rights, her area of legal expertise, when Richard suddenly stood up during her speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice carrying across the ballroom filled with San Francisco's elite, "I think my wife has made her point. Perhaps we should move on to the real entertainment for the evening." The room fell silent. Margaret felt her cheeks burning as she sat at the podium in her elegant black evening gown, her prepared speech only half finished. The audience, lawyers, judges, politicians, and business leaders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah, who had been recording the speech from the back of the room, felt her hands clench into fists. She watched as Margaret gracefully concluded her remarks, but she could see the hurt flickering behind her friend's professional smile. "That was unnecessary," Margaret said quietly as they rode home in their Mercedes, the city lights blurring past the windows. "Come on, sweetheart," Richard replied, not taking his eyes off the road. "You were going on and on about ramps and accommodations. These people came to have fun, not listen to a lecture about wheelchair accessibility." This conversation marked the beginning of a pattern that would define the next 5 years of their marriage. Richard began subtly undermining Margaret's confidence, making jokes about her limitations in front of friends, and gradually isolating her from her professional circles. During a flashback to their second year of marriage, we see Margaret's colleague, Judge Patricia Williams, a distinguished African-American woman in her 60s who had mentored Margaret throughout her career. Trying to warn her during a private lunch meeting? "Margaret, honey," Judge Williams said, her voice gentle but firm as they sat in the courthouse cafeteria. "I've been watching how Richard treats you at these legal functions. The interruptions, the dismissive comments, that's not how a loving husband supports his wife's career. He's just protective," Margaret had replied, though doubt was already creeping into her voice. "He worries that I'm pushing myself too hard." Margaret's physical therapist, Dr. James Morrison, a gentleman in his 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, had also noticed changes during their sessions. Margaret had been coming to his clinic for maintenance therapy for over a decade, and he knew her strength, both physical and mental, better than most. "Margaret, your muscle tension has increased significantly over the past year," Dr. Morrison observed during one session, his hands working on her shoulders. "Are you experiencing more stress at home?" The turning point came during Margaret's 32nd birthday party, which Richard had organized at their country club without consulting her guest list. Margaret had wanted a small gathering with Sarah, David, and a few close friends. But Richard invited his business associates and their wives instead, Carolyn Winters. Richard's business partner's wife approached Margaret's table with a sickeningly sweet smile. Caroline was everything Margaret felt she could never be: tall, blonde, perfectly proportioned, and able to walk gracefully in 5-inch heels. "Margaret, darling," Caroline said, her voice loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. "It's so inspiring how you don't let your situation stop you from trying to keep up with everyone else." The conversations around them gradually stopped as people turned to listen. Richard, who had been discussing real estate deals with a group of men near the bar, glanced over but made no move to intervene. "I mean," Caroline continued, emboldened by the attention, "some people might feel embarrassed about being the only one who can't dance at their own birthday party, but you're handling it so well." The humiliations escalated systematically over the following months. Richard began bringing colleagues home for dinner without warning Margaret, leaving her scrambling to prepare meals while managing her law practice. When she struggled to reach items in their kitchen, which Richard had deliberately designed with high shelves, he would comment loudly about her limitations in front of guests. "Honey, maybe you should stick to ordering takeout," Richard said during one particularly painful evening as Margaret attempted to prepare dinner for his business partners. "Some things just aren't practical for people in your situation." His business partner, Jonathan Crawford, a balding man in his 50s with a perpetual smirk, laughed at the comment. "Richard, you're a saint for being so patient. Most men wouldn't." The sentence hung in the air, unfinished but perfectly understood. Through a detailed flashback, we learn about Richard's affair with his secretary, Amber Walsh. Amber was 26, stunning, and had been working at Sterling Properties for 2 years. Unlike Margaret, Amber was everything that Richard's mother Eleanor had wanted in a daughter-in-law: tall, blonde, from a wealthy family, and most importantly, able-bodied. The affair had started during late nights at the office, when Richard claimed he was working on major deals. Maria Santos, Margaret's assistant, had noticed the changes in Richard's behavior. The expensive new cologne, the secretive phone calls, the way he would leave early in the mornings and return late at night. "Mrs. Sterling," Maria said carefully. One afternoon, as she helped Margaret organize her legal files, "I don't mean to overstep, but Mr. Sterling's behavior has been different lately." Margaret looked up from her case notes, her intelligent brown eyes showing a wariness that hadn't been there years before. "Different how, Maria?" "He seems distracted, and there have been calls to the house from a woman who hangs up when I answer." Margaret's brother David had been conducting his own investigation after noticing his sisters declining spirits during their weekly dinners. As a surgeon, he was trained to notice details others missed, and he had been documenting Richard's suspicious behavior. "Mags, I hired a private investigator," David revealed during one of their dinners at her favorite Italian restaurant. "I know you're going to be angry, but I needed to know what's happening." The investigator, a former police detective named Tom Rodriguez, had been following Richard for 3 weeks. His report contained photographs, credit card records, and detailed timelines of Richard's affair. The evidence was overwhelming: hotel receipts, jewelry purchases for Amber, and dozens of intimate photos taken during their secret getaways. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. Amber was 3 months pregnant with Richard's child. Sarah Martinez had been the one to break this news to Margaret, sitting in their law office late one evening as the city sparkled beyond their windows. "The baby is due in 6 months, Sarah said, her voice breaking as she held her best friend's hands. "Tom has medical records confirming the pregnancy, and the timeline matches perfectly with Richard's business trips to Los Angeles." Margaret sat in stunned silence, her world crumbling around her. Everything she had believed about her marriage, about Richard's love, about her own worth, had been built on lies. The final public humiliation came during the Sterling family's annual charity auction held at the most prestigious hotel in San Francisco. Margaret had been looking forward to the event. Having spent weeks preparing a speech about the legal aid foundation she had started, this was her chance to announce a major initiative to provide free legal services to disabled clients who couldn't afford representation. Eleanor Sterling had insisted that Margaret sit at the family table on the stage, making her disability visible. To the entire ballroom of 500 guests, Margaret wore her most elegant dress, a deep blue gown that complemented her dark hair and brought out her eyes, and had even hired a professional makeup artist for the occasion. The moment that would haunt Margaret for months occurred during the auction's main event. Richard had been drinking heavily throughout the evening, his face flushed and his usually perfect composure slipping. Amber Walsh was there as his assistant. Pregnancy. Margaret had just been introduced to give her speech about the Legal Aid Foundation when Richard suddenly stood up from his seat beside her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice cutting through the applause, "before my wife begins her presentation, I have an announcement of my own." The ballroom fell silent. Margaret looked at her husband in confusion, her prepared speech clutched in her hands. "As many of you know," Richard continued, swaying slightly as he spoke, "marriage is about partnership, about two people supporting each other through life's challenges." But sometimes he paused, looking directly at Margaret with an expression of cruel satisfaction. "Sometimes one person carries all the weight." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor Sterling's face had gone pale, and she gestured frantically for Richard to sit down, but he ignored her. "I mean, let's be honest here," Richard said, his voice growing louder. "How much partnership can you really have when one person can't even function normally? When simple things like walking upstairs or dancing at a party become impossible, challenges that the rest of us have to accommodate." Margaret felt the room spinning around her. 500 pairs of eyes were staring at her, some with pity, others with embarrassment, all witnessing her complete humiliation. "Richard, please," she whispered, but her voice was lost in the shocked murmur that had begun to ripple through the crowd. "I'm just saying," Richard continued, completely drunk on alcohol and cruelty, "that some of us make sacrifices that others can't even imagine. Some of us give up dreams of a normal family, normal experiences, normal relationships, all to accommodate." He gestured dismissively toward Margaret's wheelchair. From her perspective, Margaret felt as though she was drowning. The elegant ballroom seemed to darken around the edges, and she could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Years of subtle undermining and private cruelty had culminated in this moment of public destruction. Sarah Martinez, who had been sitting at a table near the back of the room, stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "That's a move," she shouted, but security guards were already moving toward her. David Chen, who had been at the medical professionals table, was pushing through the crowd, his face dark with rage. "Richard, you bastard, stop this right now." But Richard wasn't finished. With a cruel smile that Margaret had never seen before, he gestured toward Amber Walsh, who had been standing near the entrance looking uncomfortable. "The truth is," Richard announced to the horrified crowd, "life is too short to spend it pretending that someone's limitations don't limit everyone around them. Which is why I'm proud to announce that Amber and I are expecting our first child in 6 months." The announcement hit the room like a bomb. Eleanor Sterling actually gasped aloud, and several people at nearby tables stood up in shock. Margaret felt something break inside her chest, not her heart, because that had been breaking gradually for months, but her spirit, her sense of self-worth. everything she had built her identity upon. What would you do in this situation? Tell us in the comments below. From Amber's perspective, even she looked horrified by Richard's public cruelty. She had agreed to the affair, even agreed to have his baby, but she had never signed up to be part of this public destruction of another woman. Judge Patricia Williams, who had been sitting at the judicial table, stood up slowly, her face a mask of controlled fury. As one of the most respected jurists in California, her opinion carried weight, and the room watched as she walked deliberately toward the exit, her silent condemnation speaking volumes. Margaret somehow found the strength to speak, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the dead silence of the ballroom. "I see," she said quietly, setting down her prepared speech with hands that trembled only slightly. "Well then, I suppose congratulations are in order." With dignity that amazed everyone present, Margaret maneuvered her wheelchair away from the table and began to make her way toward the exit, her head held high despite the tears streaming down her face. What Richard Sterling didn't know, what no one except Maria Santos and a select few others knew, was that Margaret Chen had not been idle during the years of humiliation. While Richard thought he was systematically destroying her confidence and isolating her from her support network, Margaret had been conducting the most important investigation of her legal career. The revelation began 3 days after the charity auction disaster. When Margaret sat in her home office, surrounded by boxes of documents that Maria had been secretly organizing for over 2 years, these weren't random papers. They were a carefully curated collection of evidence that would bring down not just Richard but the entire Sterling Properties empire. "Mrs. Sterling," Maria said quietly, closing the office door behind her, "think it's time you knew everything I've been collecting." Maria's investigation had started innocently enough. As Margaret's assistant, she had access to the family's financial records, correspondence, and Richard's business documents that he carelessly left lying around the house. But what she discovered went far beyond simple marital infidelity. Sterling said Properties had been engaged in massive fraud for over a decade. Richard and his business partners had been artificially inflating property values, bribing city officials to approve construction permits, and most damaging of all, deliberately building substandard housing for low-income families while pocketing the difference in construction costs. Sarah Martinez arrived at the house that evening to find Margaret transformed. Gone was the broken woman who had fled the charity auction in tears. In her place sat a focused legal mind who had found her purpose again. "Sarah, I need you to look at something," Margaret said, her voice steady and determined for the first time in months, "and I need you to help me understand exactly how we're going to destroy him." The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed suspicious transfers totaling over $50 million. Email correspondence revealed Richard's knowledge of the substandard construction materials being used in low-income housing projects. Most damning of all were recorded phone conversations between Richard and city officials, discussing specific bribes for permit approvals. But Margaret's most brilliant discovery was hidden in plain sight. Richard had been using a legal loophole to avoid paying taxes on his fraud profits by claiming them as business losses. The scheme was so complex that it had taken Margaret's legal expertise to unravel it. But once she understood the pattern, she realized that Richard had essentially documented his own crimes. Through a detailed flashback, we learn how Margaret had been preparing for this moment for over a year. After noticing inconsistencies in Richard's business dealings, she had begun photographing documents, copying files, and even recording conversations. Her legal training had taught her the importance of building an airtight case, and she had been methodically collecting evidence while playing the role of the obedient, broken wife, Dr. James Morrison. Margaret's physical therapist had unknowingly become part of her support network during this period. Margaret had been using their therapy sessions to process the emotional trauma, while maintaining her physical strength for what she knew would be a difficult battle ahead. "Margaret, you seem different lately," Dr. Morrison had observed during one of their sessions 6 months before the charity auction. "Stronger, more focused. Are you working on something important?" "I'm working on reclaiming my life," Margaret had replied cryptically. Judge Patricia Williams had also been secretly supportive of Margaret's investigation. After witnessing Richard's behavior at legal functions, the judge had quietly provided Margaret with information about similar fraud cases and connected her with federal investigators who specialized in construction industry corruption. Margaret, Judge Williams had said during a private meeting in her chambers, "What you're uncovering could bring down half the corrupt developers in this city, but you need to be prepared for the fight of your life." Margaret's brother David had contributed his own expertise to the investigation. As a surgeon, he understood the medical implications of the substandard housing that Richard's company had built. Families had been poisoned by lead paint. Children had developed respiratory problems from poor ventilation systems, and elderly residents had been injured by faulty construction. "Mags, this isn't just about your marriage anymore," David had said during one of their planning sessions. "Richard's fraud has hurt hundreds of families. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for justice." The most shocking revelation came when Tom Rodriguez, the private investigator, discovered that Amber Walsh wasn't just Richard's pregnant mistress. She was also an undercover federal agent who had been investigating Sterling Properties for over a year. The preparation phase of Margaret's plan required precision timing and absolute secrecy. Working with Sarah Martinez and a team of federal investigators, Margaret spent the next 3 months building what would become the most comprehensive fraud case in San Francisco's history. Agent Amber Walsh, whose real name was Detective Amanda Walsh of the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, had been conducting a parallel investigation into Sterling Properties. When she learned about Margaret's evidence collection, the two women formed an unlikely alliance. "Mrs. Sterling," Amanda explained, during their first secret meeting at a small cafe in Chinatown, "I need you to understand that this operation has been in planning for 2 years. Your husband's company is the center of a corruption network that involves dozens of city officials, contractors, and real estate developers." Margaret's home office became a command center for the investigation. Maria Santos coordinated the logistics, while Sarah Martinez handled the legal strategy. David Chen used his medical contacts to document the health impacts of Richard's fraudulent construction. And Judge Williams provided guidance on the judicial process. The team faced several moments of doubt and potential discovery. Richard had become suspicious of Margaret's behavior, particularly her renewed confidence and the amount of time she was spending in her office. "What are you working on so intensively, darling?" Richard had asked one evening, standing in the doorway of her office with a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Just some pro bono cases," Margaret replied calmly, closing the laptop she had been using to organize evidence. "Helping some families with housing issues." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, but he seemed to accept her explanation. He had become so accustomed to dismissing Margaret's work as unimportant that he couldn't imagine she might be investigating him. The breakthrough moment came when Amanda Walsh, still playing her role as Richard's pregnant mistress, managed to record him confessing to the fraud scheme. During an intimate dinner at their secret apartment, Richard had bragged about how easy it was to manipulate building inspectors and city officials. "The beauty of it," Richard said on the recording, his voice clear and unmistakable, "is that these low-income families don't have the resources to fight back. They're grateful for any housing at all, even if it's built with inferior materials that will make them sick in a few years." Margaret listened to the recording with tears in her eyes, not tears of sadness, but tears of rage for every family that Richard had harmed, and tears of satisfaction, knowing that his own words would destroy him. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Maria Santos discovered Richard's secret safe behind a painting in his study. Using skills she had learned from her late husband, a locksmith, Maria managed to open the safe and photograph documents that proved the full extent of the corruption network. "Mrs. Sterling," Maria said breathlessly as she delivered the photographs, "these documents show bribes going back 15 years. Your husband didn't just defraud families, he helped create the whole system of corruption in this city's construction industry." With all the evidence compiled, Margaret faced her final moment of doubt. Sarah Martinez found her in her office at 3 in the morning, staring out the window at the city lights. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Mags?" Sarah asked gently. "Once we set this in motion, there's no going back. Richard will be destroyed, but he'll try to take you down with him." Margaret turned her wheelchair to face her best friend, and Sarah was struck by the strength she saw in Margaret's eyes, not the broken woman who had been humiliated at the charity auction, but the brilliant lawyer who had built a career fighting for justice. "Sarah," Margaret said quietly, "for years I let him convince me that I was the problem, that my disability made me less than whole, but I realize now that the only disability in our marriage was his complete lack of humanity. The day of reckoning arrived exactly 6 months after the charity auction. During Sterling Properties' annual shareholders meeting, Richard had planned the event as a celebration of the company's record profits, completely unaware that federal agents were already in position throughout the hotel ballroom. Margaret arrived at the meeting in a new wheelchair, a sleek, high-tech model that David had helped her choose. She wore a stunning navy blue suit that projected power and authority, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. This was not the broken woman who had fled in tears 6 months earlier. This was Margaret Chen, attorney at law, and she was ready for battle. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard began his presentation. Standing confidently at the podium, as slides showing Sterling Properties' financial success appeared on the screen behind him. This has been our most profitable year in company history. Margaret sat in the front row, her expression calm and attentive. Beside her, Sarah Martinez was recording everything on her phone. Behind them, dozens of families who had been harmed by Sterling Properties' fraud filled the audience. Maria Santos had spent weeks tracking them down and inviting them to attend. Richard's presentation continued for 20 minutes, with him boasting about successful projects, satisfied customers, and bright future prospects. He had no idea that every claim he made was being mentally cataloged by federal agents as additional evidence of fraud. Now, Richard announced, I'd like to take a moment to thank my family for their support during this successful year. My mother, Eleanor Sterling, whose guidance has been invaluable. Eleanor Sterling smiled and waved from her seat, unaware that federal agents had already frozen her bank accounts that morning. And my wife, Margaret, Richard continued, his voice taking on a mocking tone, who has tried to be supportive. In her own limited way, this was Margaret's cue. She powered her wheelchair forward and gestured for the microphone. Actually, Richard, Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system, I have something to add to your presentation. Richard looked confused but handed her the microphone, probably expecting her to deliver some brief, grateful remarks about being married to such a successful man. Instead, Margaret pressed a button on her phone, and the hotel's projection system, which Tom Rodriguez had hacked earlier that morning, began displaying documents, photographs, and recorded conversations that detailed every aspect of Sterling Properties' fraudulent operations. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret announced, her voice strong and clear, what you've been hearing about Sterling Properties' success is technically true. The company has been very successful at defrauding the city of San Francisco, bribing public officials, and deliberately poisoning low-income families with substandard housing. The ballroom erupted in chaos. Richard lunged for the microphone, but federal agents were already moving toward the stage. Eleanor Sterling stood up, her face pale with shock, demanding to know what was happening. This is a federal investigation, announced Special Agent Patricia Morrison, Tom Rodriguez's supervisor, as she flashed her badge and took control of the microphone. Richard Sterling, Jonathan Crawford, and Eleanor Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of public officials, and violation of federal housing safety regulations. From Richard's perspective, the world was collapsing in real time. The woman he had systematically humiliated and dismissed as powerless had just destroyed his entire life in front of hundreds of witnesses. He looked at Margaret with a mixture of shock, rage, and something that might have been respect. You bitch, Richard snarled as the federal agents handcuffed him. You planned this whole thing. You've been spying on me. No, Richard, Margaret replied calmly, still holding the microphone. I've been documenting your crimes. There's a difference. As the agents led Richard away, Amanda Walsh approached Margaret, no longer playing the role of the pregnant mistress. She was now clearly identifiable as a federal law enforcement officer. Mrs. Sterling, Amanda said, offering her hand to shake, I want you to know that your evidence made this case. Without your investigation, we never would have been able to build such a comprehensive prosecution. The audience was transfixed as Margaret continued her presentation, now displaying medical records showing the health impacts of Richard's fraudulent construction, financial documents proving the extent of the stolen money, and testimony from families who had been harmed. Judge Patricia Williams, who had been watching from the back of the room, came forward to offer her public support. Margaret Chen is one of the finest attorneys I have ever had the privilege to work with, Judge Williams announced to the crowd. What she has accomplished here today is nothing short of remarkable. She has not only exposed massive corruption, but she has given voices to families who thought no one would listen to their suffering. The families in the audience, mothers whose children had been poisoned by lead paint, elderly residents who had been injured by faulty construction, young fathers who had watched their homes crumble around them, began to applaud. The applause grew and grew until the entire ballroom was on its feet, giving Margaret a standing ovation that lasted for over 5 minutes. Maria Santos, watching from the side of the room, wiped tears from her eyes as she saw her employer vindicated. So completely, David Chen pushed through the crowd to embrace his sister, his pride evident on his face. "Mags, you did it. You actually did it." But Margaret's triumph wasn't complete yet. She had one more revelation for the crowd. "There's something else you should know," Margaret said, regaining control of the microphone as the applause died down. "The investigation into Sterling Properties has uncovered a corruption network involving dozens of companies and city officials. This is just the beginning of a much larger cleanup of San Francisco's construction industry." Over the following months, Margaret's evidence led to the arrest and conviction of 43 individuals, including city council members, building inspectors, and construction company executives. The stolen money, over $200 million, was recovered and used to compensate the families who had been harmed. Sterling Properties was dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to victims. Eleanor Sterling lost her mansion and her fortune, while Richard received a 20-year federal prison sentence. But perhaps the sweetest justice was personal. Margaret's legal reputation was not only restored, but elevated to legendary status. Law schools began teaching case studies based on her investigation, and she was invited to speak at legal conferences around the country about fighting corruption and advocating for vulnerable populations. Can you guess what the final twist was? Drop your predictions below. The final twist came 6 months later, when Amanda Walsh, the federal agent who had posed as Richard's pregnant mistress, revealed that she had never actually been pregnant. The pregnancy had been fake. Of her undercover operation to get closer to Richard and document his crimes, the fake pregnancy served 2 purposes, Amanda explained to Margaret during their final debriefing. It gave Richard a reason to brag about his virility and success, which made him careless about hiding his crimes, and it gave him false confidence that he was moving on to a better life, which prevented him from being suspicious of your investigation. Margaret actually laughed, for the first time in years. The man who had humiliated her for being incomplete had been completely fooled by a woman who was pretending to carry his child while building the case that would destroy him. 2 years after Richard Sterling's conviction, Margaret Chen had built the most successful civil rights law firm on the West Coast. Her office walls were covered with thank you letters from families she had helped, awards from legal organizations, and photographs of the affordable housing projects that had been built to replace Richard's fraudulent developments. Margaret's personal life had flourished as well. She had begun dating Dr. James Morrison, her former physical therapist, who had supported her throughout the investigation and its aftermath. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. Everything her marriage to Richard had lacked. Sarah Martinez had become a partner in the expanded law firm, and together they had hired a team of attorneys dedicated to fighting corruption and advocating for disabled clients. Maria Santos had been promoted to office manager, her investigative skills proving invaluable in their ongoing cases. David Chen had used his medical expertise to establish a clinic specializing in treating health problems caused by substandard housing. The clinic was funded by restitution money recovered from the Sterling Properties case and had helped hundreds of families get the medical care they needed. Judge Patricia Williams had recommended Margaret for appointment to a state commission on disability rights, where she worked to strengthen laws protecting people with disabilities from discrimination and exploitation. Even Eleanor Sterling had eventually found a form of redemption. Stripped of her wealth and social status, she had been forced to confront the cruelty she had shown to Margaret over the years. She had written a letter of apology that Margaret had graciously accepted, though she had no interest in rebuilding a relationship with her former mother-in-law. The broader impact of Margaret's investigation continued to ripple through San Francisco's construction industry. New regulations required stricter oversight of housing projects. Whistleblower protections were strengthened, and a victim compensation fund was established for families. Harmed by construction fraud, Margaret's story became a symbol of resilience and justice, proving that no one, regardless of their physical limitations or personal circumstances, should accept being diminished or destroyed by someone else's cruelty. And that's how justice was served. Margaret Chen had transformed from a victim of systematic humiliation into a champion of justice, not despite her disability, but by using her brilliant legal mind to fight for others who had been dismissed and forgotten. She had proven that true strength comes not from physical ability, but from the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. Richard Sterling learned too late that underestimating someone because of their disability was the greatest mistake of his life. The woman he had tried to crush had possessed the intelligence, determination, and moral strength to bring down his entire criminal empire. Asterisk, don't miss our next story. It's even more shocking than this one. This incredible story reminds us that karma doesn't just happen. Sometimes it requires careful planning, unwavering determination, and the courage to fight back against those who abuse their power. Margaret Chen didn't just get revenge on her cruel husband. She created a lasting legacy of justice that continues to protect vulnerable families throughout San Francisco. Remember, no one has the right to diminish your worth or limit your potential. Based on physical differences or perceived limitations, Margaret's triumph proves that intelligence, determination, and moral courage are the most powerful weapons against cruelty and injustice.